And I suppose I'm on TV out in the hallway. My name is Alan Levine. I'm one of those guys down in the district. Maricopa knows what that means. We have two speakers here who happen to be founders of software companies that actually, and I'll let them do this, do the same thing in some ways. They enable teachers to assemble materials and provide them online to their students, whether they're online courses or just materials to supplement their courses. Starting up his laptop, we have Murray Goldberg.
But there's a lot of amazing and fascinating things that are happening in the world of educational technologies. One of the really big ones that I wake up every day and am in awe of is the growth of these technologies. I'm sure you're exactly the same way. If taking our company as an example and Matt's company as an example, if we stopped selling licenses today, I think we would reach about 6 million students over the next 12 months. That's about 4 million individual students and about 1,400 colleges and universities, plus a bunch of students in 1,000 plus K-12 institutions, primary and secondary schools, a bunch of people on our free site at webct.com, and so on. These are huge numbers. I mean, these numbers, for us, they've doubled and tripled every year since we've been in business. These are really, really big numbers. So in light of this big growth, I think it's very important for everybody to kind of take a step back and think about what it is that's driving this growth. Think about what it is that's actually propelling it. And these are not things that we have, that are new, I guess you should say, or rather I should say, that are new to us. They're the same questions that have been important over the last 4 or 5 years. Things like, what is it about these technologies that will provide the best academic outcomes? What will detract from academic outcomes? What will provide the best student experience? What will actually detract from student experiences? Do lectures and websites combine very well? Do they complement each other? And if so, exactly how do they complement each other? Are there issues that we have to think of as teachers when we're actually employing these? And keep in mind, I'm a faculty member. I've been teaching online now for probably 4 or 5 years. I'm actually a computer science faculty member at the University of British Columbia. And so it was about 4 or 5 years ago that these questions occurred to us because, of course, people were starting to adopt the web a little bit in their teaching and learning. And so I applied for a grant. I guess it was back in 1995. I applied for a grant to take a look at some of these questions to try to evaluate exactly how the web was being used in education and see, was it really being effective. And it's this research, this experience, I guess, that we really have that I'm going to talk a little bit about today. And if you're thinking, as I'm sure most of you are, right away, you're probably thinking, well, this fellow's going to stand up here and tell us about this research, the supposed research that's going to tell us about how wonderful these educational technologies are. And it's a Canadian to boot, which makes it even worse. Most of the experience of the research was fairly positive, but in my own defense, let me tell you a little bit about where WebCT came from, because the research didn't come about. It wasn't influenced, of course, by the presence of WebCT. It was the other way around. WebCT came about, and WebCT was influenced by the research that we did. Like I say, back in 1995, I got a grant to basically take a course I was teaching and put it online and take a look at effectiveness. So we did that, and it was a very interesting experience. In order to do it, though, we had to have 2 very technical people build this course. In fact, this is the dark ages, in terms of the web. We had 2 very technical people who put this course online. It took about a year to do, and the cost was over $50,000. And indeed, that's Canadian dollars, so US dollars, a couple $100, something like that. But so that's a significant budget. And we took this first course, put it online. The results of the experiment were very, very positive, and naturally we wanted to broaden the experience, I guess you could say, broaden the research, look at other groups of students. So we applied for another $50,000 grant. So we got it, and after we got it, we thought, this is ridiculous. We can't build one more course and do one more round of experimentation. So instead, what we decided to do was build a nucleus of a set of tools that we could use to build similarly sophisticated courses, put them online, and do more experimentation. And that's where WebCT came from. So the whole point in saying this is that WebCT came about as a result of this initial research. Now, the research, of course, has been continued since WebCT came about. It's not the fact that it isn't the case that I'm going to tell you about all this wonderful research because of WebCT. So please keep that in mind. Now, what does this research look like? Well, the very first round of research, and like I say, keep in mind this carried on over the space of 2 or 3 years, and it's still carrying on to a certain degree now. But this research started back in 1995. We took the course that I was teaching. It was not that many students. It was about 70 students, maybe 80 students, and it was a third-year course in operating systems. And like I say, we built this online presentation of the course. Now, again, keep in mind, computer science people, we don't know what we're doing with respect to educational experiments. So we employ these people at a division at UBC called the Center for Applied Studies and Evaluation. And these people were very, very helpful in designing the experiment and making sure it was fair and even and all that kind of stuff. So we took these 70 students, we divided them into 3 groups. Group number 1 took the course entirely lecture-based in the traditional way, 3 hours of lecture a week, me being a lecturer. The second group of students took the course entirely online. They took it only lab-based, no access to lectures. I did meet with those students every 2 weeks, however, and we didn't talk about the course at all, but what we talked about was the experience of learning online, which is something actually I'll talk more about later, but I really recommend you doing if you're teaching for the first time online. The third group of students took the course and had access to both lectures and the online resources. So that they could have free use of the online resources. They came to the lectures 3 hours a week. And there are 2 things that we did. We studied both the student reaction to the way they were learning. Did they appreciate the experience? Did they dislike the experience? How much did they feel they had learned? That kind of thing. And we also studied the academic outcomes. How well did each student do in each group? Now, if you can always crowd around my monitor here, I can give you some of the numbers. Hold on for the count. But let me first cover academic outcomes first. This is a very hard thing to measure when you're conducting experiments like this because, I mean, education is a very difficult thing to measure outcomes for. Some of you may have had experience like this. So we didn't just simply take each of the 3 groups and compute the averages of each of the groups and say, well, this group did better than the other. What we did was we took a look at the most appropriate prerequisite for each student in every group. It was the same. It was the same group. So it happens to be for you computer science people, a course on data structures. We took a look at each student's grade in that second-year data structures course, and then we compared it to the grade in this new course that they were taking that was part of this experiment, the 315, the operating systems course. If the student performed within a delta of 5%, in fact, on either side in this new course, as they did in the old course, then we claim that that student has performed, they performed rather as expected. If they did 5% or more better in this new course than they did in the old course, we said that student performed worse than expected. And if they did 5% less or worse, we said that this student performed worse than expected. And then for each of the 3 groups, that is the web only, the lecture only, and the combined groups, we counted the number of students that performed better than expected, worse than expected, or as expected. Now, I had a built-in notion, again, because this was my very first use of the web. I wasn't really involved in any other way in the web. I had this built-in notion that the students who took the course entirely online would actually do worse than the lecture-only students. And it didn't work out that way. Those 2 groups of students did roughly the same. 36 and 35% of the students, respectively, of the web-only and the lecture-only group fit into the better-than-expected category. The other 2 categories were roughly similar. Now that's not a very big surprise. How many of you see the no significant difference? It's actually a really interesting survey of existing research that talks about the effectiveness of various models of education. And basically, in a nutshell, what that site says is that it doesn't really matter to an extent the media that you're using for education, the outcomes are going to be roughly the same. Now, keep in mind that most of those research articles that in surveys are fairly limited. They compare TV against lectures or distance education, paper-based distance education against lectures. Some of them do compare the web against lectures. So it's not that surprising. All I'm trying to say is it's not that surprising that indeed the web-only students and the lecture-only students fared roughly equally well. But if you take a look at the students who were in the combined offering, that is, they have full access to the web and full access to the lecture, those students did significantly better than either of the other 2 groups. And again, when I say significantly, there were only 70 students in the experiment. It wasn't statistically significant, but it was a large margin anyway. And indeed, further research has shown the same results. So you can't say that the results are significant. So in that group, 50% of the students fit into the better than expected category. That's opposed to the group 5 and 60% of the web only. That wasn't a huge surprise to me. I expected that group would probably do a little bit better. I mean, the web appeals in some ways different than it appeals to students. We took a questionnaire produced by the that I talked about, and asked them about their experiences in the course. Here's where the numbers really come in. try to summarize it as well as I can. First, we asked the student, were they satisfied with the method by which they took the course? And it turned out that the least satisfied students were the lecture-only students, and the most satisfied students were combined students. It always is a personal kind of insult to me. I feel as though that the lecture-only students were the least satisfied students. I don't know exactly why that was. I don't want to think about it too much. But I did talk to a few students about it, and some of the students said that there was this wonderful, interactive, sophisticated website that they heard that many of the other students had access to, and they didn't have access to, so they needed to about this, right? But indeed, the combined students were very, very satisfied. 67% of the students in the combined approach classified themselves as being very satisfied. 33% said they were satisfied. And if you take a look at the lecture-only group, it was way down at the bottom, only 13% versus the 67 claimed to be very satisfied. And the web-only group was in the middle, 26% claimed to be very satisfied. Again, compared to the 13 and the 67%. How did the students feel that they had learned when they were taking a pure online course? Now, we already measured what we thought they had learned, or how well, I should say, we thought they had learned. But how did they feel that they did? Indeed, it wasn't too much off the mark in terms of what we had measured. They felt that they had learned about as much in the pure web-based course as they would have in a lecture-based course, with a slight leaning to them feeling that they learned a little bit less. And in fact, the way our numbers came out, they learned. They did equally well, and maybe did a little bit better than they might have in the other course, but their perception wasn't too far off the mark. We asked them about contact with the instructor. We said, how important is it for you to have contact with the instructor? And given that contact, how often do you think that contact is important? Everybody said it was important, either important or very important. So nobody thought that the presence of a web-based resource like this, and keep in mind, this was, I obviously can't demo it for you, but it was a fairly sophisticated web-based course. It had lots of interactivity, computer simulations. Obviously, it had asynchronous discussions, tools, online assessment, all these kinds of things. So even in the presence of a resource like that, all the students thought it was important to have some kind of contact with an instructor. When we asked them what the optimal number of hours a week of lecture that they thought they would like, given the existence of this web-based resource, the average response was between 1 and 1.5 hours a week. And that's compared to the existing 3-hour-a-week lecture schedule. So it's interesting that the students thought that they could actually spend more time on the web, replace some of the, I guess, face-to-face time with some time on the web. Given the choice between lecture-only courses and web-based courses, again, I figured everybody would prefer the lecture-only courses, but in fact, there was a somewhat of a preference for the web-based course. You have to ask yourself why that is. Naturally, there's a bit of a wow factor here. This was back, the first round of this was way back in late 1995. And you know that this is going to be a new experience for the students. However, keep in mind that these are computer science students. So whatever wow factor there is about being on a computer and learning that way is probably minimized in that group of students. And again, we've repeated the same level of experimentation almost, year after year, almost without exception. And the numbers haven't changed that much. Students generally like learning on the web. We also asked them, we asked the web-only students, and this I thought was kind of a throwaway because I expected the answer. We asked the web-only students whether or not they prefer the web-based distance education experience or a paper-based distance education experience. And we only asked that of the students who had taken traditional distance ed at UBC before. When I say traditional, I mean the kind of distance ed where you phone up, you register, you get a textbook, you get a stack of paper, of notes, and you get the telephone number of the TA who you can contact in case of trouble. Now, naturally, that's a very isolating experience. And as Matt said before, one of the beautiful powers of these tools is that what they do is they allow communities to form without spatial restrictions. So clearly, a web-based distance experience is a peer-to-peer, a community-oriented experience versus the kind of experience that you would get in traditional distance ed. And indeed, we weren't overly surprised here. 87% of the students that answered that question, it wasn't 87%, it was 93%, said that they preferred the web-based distance ed experience. Would they take another course online? 87% of the students said they would take another course online. Now, again, I want to ask, we had to ask, why 13% didn't want to do that again? And without exception, the students that said they wouldn't take another online course cited motivational problems. I actually had this unfortunate experience because in the very first, I'd say 2 to 3 weeks of the course, students were beginning to drop out of the web-only portion of the experiment, in fact, which took them out of the experiment altogether. And we were wondering why that was happening, and it was web-based education going to be a complete flop. I mean, who knew? We talked to those students, and every single one of them said motivation was a problem. That is, these students were taking 4 lecture-based courses at the same time that they were taking their 1 web-based course. Now, when things started to get a little bit busy, 3rd week into the course, 2nd week into the course, what do you think suffered? Well, they managed to easily keep up with their lecture-based courses, at least to an extent, because they continued to go to their lectures. But there was no requirement for them to sign on to the web-based offering. So indeed, that was the one that began to suffer. So in our IB meetings about the process of taking a course online and so on, the students actually suggested to me that what we need to do are weekly quizzes. And so that's exactly what we did. And of course, we administered the quizzes to all 3 of the groups as we wanted to keep the experiment even across all 3 groups. But after we did that, after we supplied the necessary external motivation for these students, nobody dropped out of the web-based offering. And it wasn't a big deal in the sense that each of those quizzes, I think, I'm trying to remember if those quizzes were worth 1% each or 2% each toward their final grade. There were 6 of them over the course of the term. So it wasn't a huge amount. It wasn't a huge contribution to their final grade, but it was enough to make sure that they studied. And on the other hand, it wasn't so much that it caused them to think about possibly cheating, in the sense that there wasn't a lot of incentive to cheat because the effect on their mark wasn't going to be that great. It was going to be far less, in fact, than the effect of the effect upon their grade by them actually doing the quiz and learning. So it seemed that a very low grade quiz that had to be some grade associated with it, that was done on a regular basis, gave them the external motivation that they require. Now, maybe they signed on the day before the quiz. I'm sure, in fact, most of them did, and caught up very quickly. But regardless, it allowed them to keep up with the course. So that was something that we learned fairly quickly. In our second round of experimentation, we extended it to a number of other groups. One of the most important groups was a very large first-year class, because that 3rd-year class that I just talked about, like I said, was only 70 students. It was a computer science group of students. These are computer science majors, and it was a 3rd-year course. We wanted to broaden it out, so we took a look at a first-year class. It was a class which was a computer science topic, but it wasn't the class filled by computer science students. It was a service course, so these students would not typically major in computer science. And finally, it was a very large class. There were about 650 students in that class, divided over 3 sections. And we couldn't divide it into 3 groups. We couldn't, these are first-year students in the first term. We just couldn't bear the idea of throwing them into a web-based experience when we didn't know that much about it, and we thought they would be lost forever. We didn't want to damage them too badly. So we didn't divide them into 3 groups, but we did administer the questionnaire, a very similar questionnaire to the one we had done before. And we also wanted to take a look at their usage, to compare the usage of the online resource against the usage of the 3rd-year students. And indeed, it ended up being the case that the students in the first year used it a lot less. Now, that gap has narrowed over the years that we've replicated the experiment. To the extent that now, I would say the first-year students in first term use it probably about 70 or 80% as much as the online resources, 70 to 80% as much as the 3rd-year students. But back when we did the first round of this experiment, we found that they used it probably about 40% as much as the 3rd-year students. We asked these students because it was a very large course. We wanted to know about their feelings of community because, naturally in a very large course like that, students tend to lose their individual identity or feel as though they do in the face of the faculty member and in the face of the other students in their course. So we asked them, is a stronger feeling of community formed? And 85% in 3rd year and 62% in 1st year thought that the presence of these online tools formed a stronger community. And did it make their experience more personal? Half the students thought it made it more personal, half thought it didn't make it more personal, but almost nobody thought it actually detracted from the level of personalness, if that's a word, of the experience. I think I'm still fidgeting Fisher a little bit. So fine. Thank you very much. Let me skip down a little bit, as you can't see, but that's okay. Here's probably the most important question that we asked our students. We asked our students, how many of you are comfortable participating in a discussion? So first we asked how many of you are comfortable participating in an in-class discussion. And 50 to 55% of the students said they were comfortable making a contribution in an in-class discussion. And they cited the usual reasons for their apprehension, those that didn't want to do that. That is, you put up your hand to say something, you're not sure it's going to come out, it might be embarrassing, hopefully it's not, but you don't really have a chance to take it back if it doesn't work out. Then we asked the students, We asked our students, are you comfortable participating in an online discussion? And about 75% of the students claimed to be comfortable making a contribution in an online discussion. But the best part of this was that if you take the union of the two sets, roughly 90% of the students were comfortable making a contribution in at least one of the online and lecture-based discussion. So if by adding a web-based resource like this to a course, we're moving from something like 50% or 55% rather to 90% inclusivity, I think that's a really big win. At UBC, we have a fairly large group of students that speak English as a second language. And by and large, they're not prolific contributors to the in-class discussions. But many of them are wonderful contributors to the online discussions. And I now know intimately a very large group of students who I never, ever would have known if it weren't for the presence of these types of technologies in the learning experience. And it's not just me, it's the rest of the class that has the benefit of their wisdom now. And I've also seen the effect. It's kind of been interesting because after a talk I gave a few weeks ago, somebody came up to me and said, you know, I don't really like the idea of adding an asynchronous discussion with like a bulletin board to my class because I worry about those students who aren't comfortable participating in class. I don't want to give them an out and another avenue to discuss because it will keep them silent. They'll never break through the ice and actually contribute in class. I've actually seen the opposite happen in my experience. It's often been the case that I've seen somebody contribute contribute a lot online, seeing their ideas validated by the other students, by the other participants in the discussion, and then become brave enough to make that first contribution in class. So I actually think it contributes to the ability of people to discuss things. And of course, that's simply central to the whole educational process. And it's very nice too, because if you think about it, there's no other way for everybody in the class as a whole to be able to discuss a certain topic. I mean, in my courses, I don't actually ask my students to use these discussion lists at all. I don't tell them to. I tell them if they have a question that they're free to ask it there, and then I answer the question. My TAs answer the questions. Other students begin answering each other's questions, and that's wonderful. You see whole discussions just fly off. That can't really happen for the students as a whole without these kinds of technology. It's never been the case that after a lecture of mine, one student just stood up and said, everybody in my house tonight, you know, we're going to talk about this That simply doesn't happen. The only opportunity they have to discuss these kinds of things as a whole is in class. We don't have enough time for that. So that was a second one. Let me just sum up in terms of this particular part of the experiment. We asked the students, simply a very blanket question, did it improve? Did the presence of the online resources improve your overall experience? And almost everybody thought it did. 94% in third year and 8% in the first year, which was a little bit disturbing because actually I think we only had about 75% or 70% in first year who actually used the resources. So the number was higher than those that actually used it. I'm sure they thought that if they had actually used it, it would have. Things you just never know when you ask a question. A number of things that we learned in this experience of ours. Number one, most students require some level of external motivation. And I talked about that already with the quizzes that we gave every 2 weeks. That was very, very important. Otherwise, we've had people going at it. Another thing that I didn't really mention is that activity tracking is very important. That's something that these technologies bring. It's important in the sense of knowing, I mean, when you're lecturing in a face-to-face environment, you know if people are nodding off or if they're paying attention. You can tell, obviously, if they're asking questions, you can tell that online as well. You can tell if they're present. I mean, that's a very basic one. Online, you can't necessarily. Again, the very first time I taught a web-based course, it was kind of weird because I felt like I was teaching through a one-way mirror and I was on the reflective side. I had no idea what my students were doing unless they actually contacted me. And I had a group of students, again, in this very first offering, that in the first couple of weeks never even signed on. And they didn't sign on for random reasons. I mean, they had a little bit of trouble with access to technology or they just didn't realize the start date had already passed, this kind of stuff. But the course that I was teaching was a very paced course and a very heavy course. And for those students that hadn't begun the course in the first couple of weeks, they were lost. There was almost no way they could catch up. And so this was very distressing to me. So what many of these tools have now, and FCT certainly has, is activity track, so you know what your students are doing. So one thing that I do for the first few weeks of my course is I take a look at the activity tracking and I can see at the top who hasn't signed on yet onto the online resource. And I send an side test. And it's wonderful because the students see a hue on the other side. They know that they somebody cares or appears to care, and not cares. And it's very easy to do, and it's a real help to those students. It's been positive in every single instance that I've done it, and by and large, the students made it up. And I use that activity tracking actually throughout the course as well, because over the weeks of the course, I take a look at the opposite, which is not their first sign-on date, but when was their most recent sign-on date. And if somebody hasn't signed up for a couple of weeks again, that may be the signal of a problem. It's wonderful to be able to casually send them a reinforcing email message and let them know that, if there's a problem, that you're happy to help. Very, very nice kind of thing to be able to get progress done. Learning goals should be clearly stated. That's something else that we learned. My students in my very first offering told me, we'd have no easy way without embarrassment to ask you what's going to be on the exam or what's important, that kind of thing. So associate learning goals with every piece of content that you put out in your course. I think your students will thank you for it. The conferencing tool, the asynchronous discussions, extremely important. We've already talked about that. I won't go into that again. Encourage pedagogy discussions with your students. This was something that helped me immensely as a teacher the first time, and I think helped the students as well. It's a very interesting effect when you and your students get together to talk about the process of learning. I think almost as much learning goes on in those kinds of discussions as actually goes on in the course proper. How many of you have actually taught online? Or teach online, put it that way. And so many of you are actually new to it. If you are or will be new possibly to it, if you are going to be trying it, it's a wonderful thing. Dedicate, if it's a pure distance, you may not have the ability to meet with them face to face. Dedicate a forum in the discussion area to the process of learning online. I think you and your students would be very valuable. No huge time or cost savings. I think we're all learning that now. There was something interesting a while ago. Everybody thought that this was going to be wonderful. It was going to reduce the cost of education. Well, it doesn't do that. I mean, you can do it cheaply. You can teach face-to-face cheaply too, and you can do a bad job at both. But if you want to do a job, it's not going to be any cheaper. And in fact, initially, the cost is higher because you have to actually produce content, which we'll talk about. Maybe you don't. We'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes. But in the steady state, when you're actually delivering a course, it takes me roughly the same amount of time to teach online that it does for me to teach in a lecture-based environment. But what I believe is we're actually doing a much better job. The students are happier. I think the academic outcomes are higher for no extra cost, to put it that way. It's certainly about improving education as opposed to saving costs. And the number one conclusion for these experiments that we did, the web is great, lectures are great, but really the best thing that we can do is bring these two together. Each one deals in different ways, satisfies the certain need that the other one doesn't have.
So the goal of my talk is actually exactly what was described before. I'm probably not going to get into comparing and contrasting the companies, although hopefully in question and answer we can do that, but it's to really talk about the future of what I call .edu, what everybody calls .edu, but people don't think about it that way. And obviously .edu is largely about how to bring teaching and learning online, because that's a part of what colleges and universities are about. But we all know it's about more than that. Teaching and learning happens outside the course. It happens in a lot of aspects of the university environment and the college environment, and the internet is impacting a whole range of activities on a typical college campus, not just the course itself. And all of those are sort of blending together. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Well, it's the visual of two sumo wrestlers. So you have to bulk up a little bit. But it's the issue of two sumo wrestlers. So the reason why I do two sumo wrestlers is I can't think of a better metaphor from what we're all experiencing, whether we're in the classroom or whether we're at a software company providing the technology that gets used in the classroom. And the first sumo wrestler is the internet, which is the fastest growing mass market medium in the history of the world. And this statement has been said all the time, but I really do believe it. The internet is changing everything and changing how we interact with people, how we communicate, how we do all sorts of activities. And on the right-hand side, you've got education, in this case, higher education, which is, and we don't think of it this way, but actually education is the second largest industry in the country. It's 10% of the U.S. gross domestic product. And it's one of the oldest industries in the world when you think about it. And it's fundamentally about teaching, and it's really about content and communication and collaboration. But when you think about the internet, it's really about content, communication, and collaboration. Higher education helped create the internet. And when you think, though, of the internet and all the places that it's changing, when you think of how it's changing books, you think of Amazon, you think of how it's changing auctions, when you think about how it's changing communication with email, how is it going to change education? And it's ironic that we have lived with the internet longer than anybody. And yet, I think we are probably one of the newer segments of society that has begun to really harness the internet for making a difference in teaching and learning. It's also ironic when you think about a building like this. And this is particularly true in residential campuses. But you think about, for example, on a residential campus, schools that have wired their dorms to the point where they have a port per pillow or 2 ports for every dorm room. And so students show up with computers and play video games like Duke Nukem, which if you're familiar with them are a lot of fun, but clearly all the technology can be used for a more powerful purpose. And yet when you look at a typical IT infrastructure, this is when someone like Ron Lee spends a lot of his time both here and at EDUCAUSE and elsewhere. When you look at a typical IT infrastructure for a university, we've wired up the dorms. We have operating systems like Unix and NT. We have administrative systems like PeopleSoft and SCT or HomePro systems that do things like student information systems and make sure that we get our bills paid and make sure that we get paid as faculty members. But there has been a complete absence of this other category of software called teaching and learning systems, which isn't to say that we don't integrate technology into the classroom, because that's been happening for a while, whatever that technology may be, HyperCard. But there isn't an enterprise system similar to what PeopleSoft does on the administrative side to support the academic process. And that's really, I think, the hole that Blackboard was developed to fill, that WebCT has been developed to fill, that other companies have been developed to fill, which is what are going to be, and there are many vendors on the administrative side, and similarly there'll be many vendors on the academic side. But clearly that is the heart of what a university like college does, is teaching and learning. And so to provide those systems, but then more than that. And that's actually the big news at the recent release of ours. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But it's more than that. Because after you bring your administrative services online, and after you bring your teaching and learning services online, what is the total campus platform or portal environment that can aggregate it together? So now when I log in as a faculty member or as a student into my Maricopa, I can get access to my courses, access to my task IDs, access to my course announcements, whether I'm teaching or learning. But I can also get access to changing my records for where my payroll check goes. I can also get access to buying my books online. I can get access to a whole range of services. Because when you really think about .edu, it reaches out to students before they ever come to campus, continues with them as alums long after they've left campus, and lifelong learners, as well as all the constituencies that were on campus. And those are the building blocks that are being assembled. And as we're in a classroom teaching, thinking about it from a pedagogical standpoint, ease of use standpoint, how do we bring content? There's another constituency sitting in the system office that is thinking, I just invested in an administrative system that's going to be used by a universe of 150 people. And here's another class of systems that's going to be a universe of 20,000 people. And they're going to use it at 1 a.m. on a Sunday night. So that's the other half of what I'd like to talk about. By the time I'm done telling you what I'm going to talk about. So I'd like to talk about the teaching and learning side, but also talk about the administrative side, because that's a very important piece of it. And we'll do it against 4